Good evening from Dunrovin Ranch, Montana, on a very rainy April. I'm skipping ahead. It's March still. March Sunday afternoon. Welcome to the Western Women's Book Club. This is our third book, and it has been a delightful book to read. On my left, I have, as always, Judy Blunt, who is our online hostess. And on my left, we have a guest speaker today, David Moore, who is a professor of English at the University of Montana, who has focused much of his career on American studies, Native American studies, and Western American literatures. Is that correct?
That hits it, yeah.
All right. And our author of the book that we've been reading, The Jailing of Cecelia Capture, Janet Campbell Hale, is unable to be with us, but David has a very deep knowledge of and connections to the Native American community, particularly the writing community, and he will be able to help us shed some light on this particularly rich, detailed, and very complex book and complex subject. David also has written a book called The Dream Shall Have a Name, Native Americans Rewriting America, and I'd like to know something about that book. Can we start off with you telling us something about the content of that particular book?
Sure. Let me start by just saying I am not speaking for Native America. I'm married into Indian communities, and I've lived a lot of grateful years as part of some communities, but I'm not Native American, and I'm happy to be reading and reflecting on what these voices say. And also, by way of beginning, I'd like to thank the Salish people on whose land we are residing right now. They've been very hospitable for more than a century to all of us here.
Indeed.
My book is built on teaching Native American literature for 40 years and more, and it addresses questions that often come up in discussions about Native American authors and Native American history. And I could go through, there are 5 different areas that I find people are really concerned about, and I factor them into like community and identity issues. Authenticity too frequently comes up, but also a sense of tribal sovereignty is always underneath the conversations. And then there's this amazing humor and power of survival that comes up, which triggers irony in relation to the powerful strength to survive against the weight of history. And those ironies are both positive and negative, and painful and full of laughter. So the book looks at Native writers from the 19th century through the current time in terms of those various issues that people are always wondering about.
And did you draw from Native American peoples across North America, including Alaska, for example?
Well, it starts with William Apis, who was a Pequot from Connecticut and Massachusetts in the 1820s and 30s. And then it looks at Sarah Winnemucca, who was a great activist of the Northern Paiute in the 1880s, speaking tour from Baltimore to Boston, built on her book, Life Among the Paiutes. And then Darcy McNichol in the early 20th century was a Salish writer and scholar from Montana, but he traveled in Europe and worked all over the United States and Central and South America. And then Leslie Silko is a very famous Laguna Pueblo writer from the latter part of the 20th century into the current time. And then Sherman Alexie is also a Northwest writer whom many people have heard about. He calls himself the Indian du jour in his early 1990s publications. So it is east and west, north and south.
I just wanted to mention that National Public Radio has a Native American news.
Yes.
And it emanates from Anchorage, Alaska.
Yes.
And I listen to it frequently.
Yeah.
And I watched all of that kind of unfold in Alaska in terms of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act.
Yes.
And
that's a history.
A lot of history there.
Yeah.
And it pleases me to see that strong voices have risen from that.
Indeed.
And given some resources, people can do a lot.
And that's the trick, given the resources.
Yeah.
And indeed, part of the undercutting of development in Indian country has to do with this constant erasure of their own resources, their own dispossession of the land, obviously, but also a really dysfunctional relation to federal power that undercuts both cultural and economic development.
Well, we so appreciate you coming this evening and bringing your voice to this discussion.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it was as I said, our discussions on the chat were very complex. I think all of us found a lot of we learned a lot from this book. We found little bits and pieces that reflected some of our own personal experiences, but I also think we found a lot that none of us could really identify with. And I think that was one of the major themes of our discussions. Now, Diane has summarized, and I think both of you have a copy of some of the comments that she summarized. And I'll let you start off, Diane and Judy, and then maybe we can bring David into the conversation on some of our, kind of our preamble here, how difficult this was, a book to read, very visceral, very detailed, and extremely honest. It seemed like she laid bare, a very intense emotional and self-doubt seemed to just permeate the book. So with that, let's move on to kind of point one, which you want to read that, Diane? Do you have that in front of you so you can remind people?
I do have it. In all of the books that we've read, we have noted the importance of an oral tradition or storytelling over the centuries in each of the groups. And interestingly, the first two books, of course, were about the history of Montana. And I think that that's probably part of this story, too, because Cecelia Capture is so part of her whole persona is her tribe and its culture. But with the modernization of communications and all of the things that are going digital, do you think this tradition is still as strong in this culture? And if it's not as strong, what do you think that implies for generations to come?
Well, I think that as a writer, it's only in the 20th century that we have seen women, Western women, stepping forward to write about their lives. I mean, there are some, as told to stories earlier on, a lot of kind of rosy-colored journals across the plains and the covered wagons, but when it comes to the nitty and gritty, that storytelling is relatively modern. Compared to the history of Native Americans, for instance, the schooling and just the impulse to write things down, I think, perhaps comes later to us. But there's also, it's a double-edged sword, because when you come from a small, closed community that is a bit fragile or even broken on the edges, sometimes the community itself doesn't like these stories being told. And so sometimes there is a backlash. I suffered a certain amount of that in a relatively benign form because I wasn't living there. But I know from other stories of friends of mine who have written about reservation life, or they've written about, tribal connections, sometimes there's a backlash.
I'd like to hear from you about that very issue. How, do you know anything specifically about the author and how well her book was received among her own people? And then is it common, particularly for women. Actually, I have 3 questions.
Good.
You also brought up something very interesting to me, and that is, I know that storytelling is a very deep Native American tradition, but was storytelling with women at the center of those stories a deep tradition?
Absolutely, sure. Grandma.
Grandma.
Would be telling. The minute she says trickster, all the kids are already laughing.
Right.
And, yeah, I think storytelling pervaded and pervades families across gender. I wish I knew Janet Campbell Hale's own story more directly in relation to this publication, but I can say generally that, communities are proud of the achievements, but there is always going to be somebody feeling uncomfortable in just the ways that Judy was saying. But there is of course, a longer history where Native publications since the 19th century tended, autobiography and personal narrative really did emerge in the mid-19th century. There's a George Copway is an Ojibwe that was publishing before 1850. And the pattern of those early autobiographies was, here's my story, listen to my people's history. So that the personal and the cultural and the, call it, national histories were deeply interwoven. And that pattern continued into the 20th century. But in the latter 20th century, the achievement, partly through university education of many of these writers, brought out these amazing voices. And there's a full spectrum of the kind of personal focus and the community focus. You can see it in 1969. N. Scott Momaday won the Pulitzer Prize for Housemaid of Dawn, and it's a coming home, rediscovering identity in a Pueblo novel. And there's a similar story by Leslie Silko that followed that is less individualized and more communal. But then in the same period we have Janet Campbell Hale speaking a very personal story without a lot of community drawn into it. So that there's individual voices filling that spectrum of drawing on the oral traditions either directly or indirectly. But I think she's obviously doing it indirectly.
Mm-hmm. I think you bring up a really interesting issue that I've struggled with whenever I've had contacts in Native American communities. And it seems that unlike white Americans, Native American communities really do value the community sort of above the individual. Mm-hmm. And it seems like white Americans, we value the individual above the community. There's a disproportionate here.
I really hear that. And I think it's possible to expand that to urban versus rural differences.
Yeah.
Because
mm-hmm.
everybody knows a farm community is a community, and everybody needs to be on board.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the claim for individuality is related partly to an urban isolation, but I think there's another loop to that wonderful question, where people make similar comparisons with Japanese culture versus American. Mm-hmm. But what happens if you're looking at another culture where that divide between individual and group isn't functioning? Then you're not talking about individuals and groups. It's like to get into that other view, you almost need a different language, like Japanese, or where who I am is my family, or who I am is my culture. It's not a question of I am an individual in a group. It's I'm both. And so it's hard to grasp, I think, because our language is so culturally categorized.
And we think in our language.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm going to diverge just a little bit here, but it reminds me of a movie I saw called The Fast Runner. Have you ever seen that movie?
The Fast Runner, yeah.
The Fast Runner.
Yeah.
And it's about the Inupiat.
Yeah.
And what amazed me about that movie and what made me sort of understand a visceral level is when a culture is at the edge of survival, physical survival, where every calorie that they expend counts for something. There is no we and they. I mean, you can't afford it.
Right.
You know, and it just seems that perhaps that's at part of the root here, is that, you know, the Native American cultures were bound to each other in a survival dynamic.
And still are.
And
I mean, there are ways that, and I really appreciate you putting Native American cultures in the plural, because there are so many differences, and that different tribal uniqueness is at the heart of all the stories, really. But yeah, Judy, you were going to say something?
I just, you know, pulling it back to the text, one of the elements I thought that this story really brought home was the fragment or the fragmentation of that community and of that culture is symbolized or mirrored in the breakup of her family. The dysfunction, her mother is not a mother, her father is not a father, they are not a couple, they're not, you know, communicating on the same level. There is a lot of just kind of falling away, and you know, on a very close personal level, it's mirroring what she's also saying is happening on the larger.
And the way Diane mapped it, though, in the prologue to these questions, is that by the end, when she makes, you know, an affirmation that she's going to get this law degree and take care of her kids, that incorporates all that we're saying.
Yes.
In a sense, she's fulfilling her father's dreams, right? Which is validating that connection, but it is an individual pulling herself up by her bootstraps. That's happening. So it's both and, rather than either individual or group, which is, I think, part of that healing feeling at the end, that you somehow dissolve those boundaries.
Right.
And that's literature.
Well, there's a stepping forward to self-leadership, too, where she has struggled from the time she was 16 to find someone who will take care of her and who will nurture her. And that is, she's been turned back at every front. And then, you know, on the gravesite, when she's making her peace with her first lover, who is dead, and deciding not to kill herself, to be a mother, to be a lawyer, to be these things, she's stepping into a world where she is going to be directing her own future. That, to me, speaks, it may be an individual, but it speaks of strength and self-determination in a way that's where I believe the optimism comes from, or at least it did for me, is in that the strength.
But looping it again,
in a way, though,
it's on behalf of family.
In many ways lead into the third question that I had here, which is the struggle, the desperate struggle she seems to have with belonging, or knowing where she belongs. She doesn't have a place where she belonging to two cultures mean you don't belong to any, because you don't feel fully comfortable in any of them. And at the end, she decides to not commit suicide, and I think it's implicit that she's decided to fit into the native culture. Is this a frequent theme in Native American writing, this straddling of two cultures?
Absolutely. There's the book on the subject is by Lewis Owens, called Other Destinies, Understanding the American Indian Novel. And he makes the point, which others have disagreed with slightly, that the mixed blood identity is the key key theme in Native American novels, where indeed the two worlds live in the very DNA of the protagonist. And you can map a lot of novels, including Leslie Selko's famous Ceremony, which Sherman Alexie said is the great American Indian novel. And then he said, and I should know.
Oh, Sherman.
He likes to do that.
He's a
but that is indeed the issue. But I need to come back around exactly to what we were saying. There's another great scholarly study by Jace Weaver called That the People Might Live, Native American Literature and Community is the subtitle. And he says that community is the dynamic in Native American fiction. And it's exactly because Lewis Owens is focusing on individuality and identity, and Weaver is focusing on community, and the problem is
both.
And
Yes,
they
yes.
can't be, and each of them is smart enough, of course, to and articulate and insightful and scholarly enough to identify the other piece in each pole, where the individual needs the community and the community is built of individuals. And so, but that is indeed a central issue in so much of the literature. It goes all the way back. Well, you were saying before we got on the air that you were in touch with the Onondagas in upstate New York, and back in the day I taught at Cornell in Ithaca and grew to know and love that Haudenosaunee community that, as you know, is very strong. The Grand Council still meets, as they have for over 1,000 years at Onondaga of the Six Nations. And they, are built on this sense of community, but there's this powerful individuality of the voices in council and elsewhere. But they have an ancient teaching called the two-row wampum, which is, and there's a famous, ancient wampum belt where there's two rows of that beautiful purple shell in parallel, and this was from their, I think, 16th and early 17th century treaties with the Dutch before the English in New York, where they said, we're going to go in our canoe and you can go in your canoe, and we're going to be two rows going down river together, and it's really hard to put a foot in both canoes. And it's an ancient, literally ancient question of two cultures. There was a wonderful conference at the University of Montana just this weekend called Thinking Its Presence. You can look that up online. The racial imaginary was the focus. And there was, in the audience and on the microphones, there were various Native American as well as other people of color. And this one woman said from the audience, she used to be told that, she was living in two cultures, and she thought that's a weird thing. I just feel like myself. And then she realized the two worlds challenge is really constant for Native Americans. So yeah, she's validating what you're saying. But again, part of the trick, literally, is to not play the game of either or, even in that two cultures thing. And I, Cecelia decides to become a lawyer, thank you very much. And she's not going to become, a medicine woman back in her, tribal homelands. She's going into the new Indian wars in the courts, basically. And so she's living in two worlds, but she's doing that with, she's going straight across that opposition, but she's doing it on a deeper, larger field of family and tribal affiliation and loyalty. So, and this is a dynamic that you see in many writers. They can't fight the weight of history, and so they trick their way into more subtle and broader stories. It's like finding a map that they can stand their ground on, instead of just being overwhelmed by that so-called frontier that keeps wanting to wash them away under the wave of manifest destiny.
Yeah. Well, it's easy to see in this book how Cecelia Capture struggles to identify with her father, the Indian part of her heritage, and she clings to it throughout, but trying to find a way that identification doesn't backfire on her somehow, isn't at the root of some sort of bad thing coming down the pike. And it's only at the end when she takes the dream of her father, which was to straddle these worlds in a way, and makes it her own. And in that way she, that's her way of identifying with her native heritage, but in a way that had already begun to evolve, through her father's education.
I found it very interesting, some of the passages that she wrote about the three men in her life, other than her father. And when her husband, who is a white professor, there's a passage in here where she talks about wearing his culture, marrying him and inheriting his culture, kind of wearing it. And from my own perspective, that resonated just a little bit with me, because I married into a very academic family, and I'm a daughter of a Butte miner. And I felt the weight of that difference. I mean, it wasn't nearly what she was facing, but I felt it nonetheless, and I thought, I can feel that.
Yeah.
And then with Running Horse, the young man that she had a fling with in Oregon, there's this beautiful passage. It brought me to tears about how his native body spoke to her in ways that
the shade of their skin,
of their skin, and the lack of hair. And I lived in South America for a period, and Native South Americans were very proud of any kind of body hair because it indicated European blood. And that brought that story back to me. And that us looking like somebody, and that primal identity, that visceral identity. And then the young man that died, her love, that was almost an easy love because he died. He was she was 16, he was 19.
They had one night.
He froze right there.
Right.
Yep.
Forever young.
Forever young and forever pure in the realm of these issues.
And his name was Bud, which is an unopened flower.
And
also a pal.
And also a pal. Yeah.
Well, you're mapping the complexity so nicely. There's this chant that gets overused, but I'll say it backwards. Gender, class, and race are all at work in what's going on here, and again, those are not divided. Where she's married to a white professor, that's a class thing, and of course it's a gender thing, and of course it's a race thing, and each of those, that's a wonderful set that where each of those touches and plays on those issues, either positively or negatively. Indeed.
But she wrote about it so beautifully. You could feel it. You could feel where they fit and where they didn't fit.
Yeah. That's an achievement. Indeed.
I think that was the power of her writing. She could bring you into her mindset.
Right.
Mhm.
Well, and you could feel the betrayal of the parents. I mean,
Yeah.
they betray her deeply, and yet there still seems to be, the struggle to, if not forgive, at least make your peace with. She never quits loving her father,
Mhm.
even though he is, not much help.
Well, and part of that love is going back to just what David said was she inherited an expectation because she was the last child and she wasn't a boy.
Right.
So her previous three sisters who didn't get that same kind of expectations filled into her. He filled her with something that in the end was her saving grace. But she wouldn't have gotten
he gave
that.
her the tool of the love of education and the need to have education to succeed.
Mhm.
He gave her tools, even if he didn't give her support.
Yeah.
There's a history around that may be worth for context in terms of these this generation of writers. It's been called the Native American Literary Renaissance that was launched in 1969 when Momaday won the Pulitzer Prize for Housemaid of Dawn, and that unleashed a flood, to mix metaphors, of writing where basically all these brilliant young educated Native Americans said, "Oh, people are listening? I'm going to start writing."
Yeah.
And that generation of Leslie Silko, James Welch, Joy Harjo, Simon Ortiz, Louise Erdrich, Gerald Visner, their parents were often, not always, World War II veterans from the Indian country who had gone to college, at least briefly, if not for degrees, on the GI Bill. And that GI Bill is actually part of the history of this renaissance or flowering of Native American expression, because the second generation of educated family members became this cadre of amazing writers, and there are literally hundreds now at this point. And it's and there's 2 or 3 waves now since the 60s and 70s.
You are mentioning a number of books, and I'm sure some of us are going to want to follow up.
I hear that coming.
Yes.
Email is a blessing.
Yes, but you'll email it to me so I can
Sure.
post it.
Oh,
That
yeah.
would be really wonderful. I'd appreciate that.
I've been trying to write them down. We have a question from one of our chatters that I wondered if maybe now would be a good time to ask David a question.
Okay.
We have someone who's wondering if you would talk about how James Welsh fits into this group since he's a local.
Sure. He is part of that first wave of what's been called the Native American Renaissance, and a lot of us don't really want to hang on to that term because it implies that there weren't writers before that in Indian country. And as I mentioned, mapping my book, there have been writers in English and French and Spanish from a Native American background since 1525 in Peru, and there's just been a whole history there. But Jim, who was a dear friend of mine, was indeed part of this major first wave that some have pointed out has become like the canon of Native American literature. Names that I've mentioned already, he's at the peak of those. His first novel, Winter in the Blood, made a big splash on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, and the rest is kind of history. And he started as a poet in the graduate program under Richard Hugo here, and there's a very moving story where he was trying to write poems about seagulls and ocean lovely stuff, and Hugo and it was not very good poetry, and Jim knew that, and Hugo knew that, and Hugo said, "You don't know much about poetry, do you?" And Jim said, "Well, I'm afraid not." And Hugo said, "Well, what do you know about? Write about that." And that opened up this young writer to writing his life on the High Line. He's Blackfeet and Grovon from Browning and Harlem, Fort Belknap, and the Blackfeet reservations both. And so he started writing poems, and then he expanded those into fiction. And he each of his novels, and he did nonfiction as well. He didn't go back to poetry, but each of them is unique and almost like by a different writer. He was very disciplined and brilliant as a writer, and indeed he holds a place in that major set of names launching this new wave of writing.
The new wave of writing, I see it as it became commercially viable in a way that it hadn't been before.
Yeah.
Books like Fool's Crow, books like Winter in the Blood that was shortlisted for the Pulitzer.
Right.
These are books that made inroads into traditional literature, and it wasn't just segregated into this niche of Native American letters.
Exactly.
They became an important part of American letters, and the strides forward that generation made, I think, were some of the most dynamic ever.
And it's worth linking it indeed to the larger American and Euro-American modernism. Momaday did this, Silko does this, Winter in the Blood has this internal dialogue that's really stream of consciousness in the mode that 20th century readers came to expect after James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, where that powerful internal, and of course it goes all the way back to the 18th century, but there's a novel tradition of this psychological novel, basically, that moves through Native American characters in ways that are familiar to modernist readers, and it made accessible suddenly both the cultures and the humanity of those individuals. Right. And I think that was part of the dynamic of that splash that happened in the 60s, in the 70s and 80s, really. And then it was Sherman Alexie started his flood of personal output in the early 90s, and he refers to Jim Welch as his grandfather, his literary grandfather. Jim was in the audience when Sherman said that, and later Jim said, "I wish he'd said father instead of grandfather." but they're very deeply woven, and James Welch is, of course, profoundly respected. There's a new volume called Off the Path that's a publishing venture by Adrian Jawort, who's a Northern Cheyenne journalist and fiction writer. Really energetic. It's I don't remember the full subtitle, but it's something about new Native American writing by 21st century Montanans. And there are 5 different writers in there, and that book, the preface that Adrian puts that in context is gestures to James Welch as the inspiration for speaking his life with such articulate insight. And Welch is indeed, he's as you can see in his poetry, he shapes language in ways that are unique. He really, and he owes a great debt to Richard Hugo for that, whose syntax is sometimes grotesque in all the right ways. And Jim picked up a freedom to reshape English in ways that I think are part of the power of his prose and his poetry.
Mm-hmm.
That goes back to that thinking in the language, doesn't it? And language can become very confining.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. And James Welch wasn't a speaker of Blackfeet or Gros Ventre. Grew up mostly with English as his first language.
Don't you get a cadence with the syntax? You get the cadence of that language.
There's somebody's dissertation right there.
It's wonderful. And if you read Fool's Crow, and everyone alive should read Fool's Crow, it's one of his masterpieces. There is that cadence throughout that book. It's like poetry. Yeah,
Fool's Crow is, as many have said, is probably the best representation we'll have of the mind of a 19th century High Plains culture.
Isn't that one of the pretty traditional topics or themes, is that cusp between the buffalo and the no buffalo, that cusp when the old ways broke and the reservations appeared, in that 50 years, the last 50 years of life as it was, with the white man coming in and the change on the horizon. And
indeed. It's funny you should say that, though. That is a background, but I don't know of many writers other than Jim Welch who focused, as he did, a fiction in that period. I think Robert Conley has done several of those, but Leslie Silko has a wonderful novel, Gardens in the Dunes, which is based on the turn of the 20th century period in California Indians. And of course, Darcy McNichol, whom I mentioned earlier, his novels are based in the 1930s, when things were coming out of some of the lowest points in Native American populations, and the Reorganization Act of 1934-35 was trying to revitalize tribal governments and things. But there aren't a lot of
diaspora occur
novels.
When they sent Indians from reservations and transplanted them in?
It's called relocation.
Relocation.
And there's a whole, you can look at a history from basically annihilation through assimilation through self-determination, but in between there is termination and relocation. Yeah. That was the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s, when after the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, of course that was interrupted by World War II, but things were basically not improved in Indian country. But also a certain conservative element in the federal government wanted to terminate any federal treaty obligations to tribes, and one of the ways to do that was to relocate families into urban centers where they would become good factory workers. Yeah. And there's a whole history there as well. That's deep in the heart of Housemaid of Dawn. That character is relocated, and his girlfriend is a social worker in L.A. Yep. And there are other novels that play on that theme as well. But yeah, all of that history, allotment in 1887, the boarding school assimilation and abduction policy, kill the Indian, save the man, and into Indian Reorganization Act, relocation, federal policies, self-determination of 1974, those are, and 75, it's amazing how much that history of federal Indian policy permeates these fictions, because every Indian lives with that, and it shapes the communities and the family dynamics. And so it seems daunting for people new to Native voices to somehow get that history, but it's available.
Well, and it's very recent.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things too that people sort of think of it as being in the 1800s, and it's not.
Right.
You know, and I will say that moved to Alaska in the 70s, and we're talking what happened in Alaska happened even more recently.
Right, exactly.
I mean, I actually saw some of the villages go through this transition where at one point your native heritage was not important. I mean, a lot of Russians were intermarried, and they were fishing villages. And then suddenly, because the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, everybody was counting their bloodlines, and they started, the tensions just grew because that racial thing got right in there in between the communities.
And that's federal policy. It goes all the way back to allotment, deciding who's competent to manage their land based on their blood quantum.
Yes.
You know, and then that's been transferred into tribal membership roles and criteria.
Well, Montana, maybe across the nation, it sticks in my mind, 1954 was that when citizenship was for or was that voting rights? I think
citizenship was 1924. Native American citizenship nationally. Just only 4 years after women got the vote.
Yeah.
In 1920.
Seems to me there was a Montana.
Just the other day.
In the early 60s, I remember seeing signs in the windows of bars in Dodson, Montana, no dogs, no Indians.
Right.
And they were still being,
Same thing in South Dakota.
White-colored, sort of.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I saw, in 1963, I was in Jacksonville, Florida as a 12-year-old, and there was a drinking fountain, two drinking fountains on the railroad platform, white in color.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly recent. Well, just this, tomorrow I'm going to a funeral for beloved Evelyn Stevenson, who was a lawyer who established the tribal court in the last generation. Just building the infrastructure of community from the legal to the cultural, all of that has been revitalized in the last generation.
And it continues to evolve. I mean, every generation has another something to say. There's she asked in the second question about
I was going to go
place,
to
and interesting and complex, of course, also in Native American cultures because of the reservations. These are not always places they would have selected for themselves. They often were places or landscapes that were seen as less arable, not as valuable, certainly.
Or if they were, those were allotted out and taken by the
and then they were sometimes put together with historical enemies on the same landscape, which, I mean, how many checks, down
kind of like the Middle East.
Kind of, like making them all go to the same school. Anyway, so I think that you see her moving, Cecelia Capture moving from place to place to place, and not really, even though she touches down on the reservation and finds friends for the first time. But, the schooling lacks. She basically quits getting educated and drops out of school, and away she goes again. She finds what she calls sidewalk Indians, or the sidewalk redskins, she calls them, the urban Indians. And all of these different places that she might belong aren't really her places.
When I was a very young man, and first living in Indian country, and of course Indian country is North America and South America, and
Australia,
right? Aboriginal country. I was at the University of South Dakota partly because I could study Lakota language there, and a friend of mine in classes was Faith Spotted Eagle. She's now a kind of famous Indian activist in South Dakota. And I remember saying rather naively something about how difficult it must be to be on the reservation, that home place. And she said, that's our home. We treasure that. Sure there were suicide, drug, alcohol rates 10 times,
all the problems. But
well, people don't realize we're struggling with a 5 to 7% unemployment rate. It's 80% on most reservations. It's just another world. But that the preciousness of that homeland is both validating and it creates a whole different legal history from African American experience as well.
I think it's interesting too that there are, especially in towns in Montana, areas where Native Americans have sort of claimed a community spot. You think of Hill 57 in Great Falls, for instance, areas where they gathered and made their own community, and that became certainly ghettoized, but it became their own place, where generations lived.
And writers like Leslie Silko and others, and I think Jim Welsh does this as well. They use place as a ground, literally, for all of these issues that we're talking about. It is that larger field where these questions play out, but if you can keep in touch with that ground, you can navigate the question.
It's so much he and I would talk about place because I wrote a place-based memoir, and we grew up in the same area over in eastern Montana, and the difference between my father's connection to his land was commercial. It was also emotional. I mean, but there was a sense of ownership. And Jim would say spiritual. Your connection to your land is spiritual. You can't own the land as much as you become part of its spirit life, and your ancestors become part of its spirit life. And
I hope you write down those conversations sometime.
Oh, he and I had great times.
Yeah.
Because we were, I was raised in a community between 3 reservations, and there was Rocky Boy, the one, the Fort Peck, Fort Belknap, and then across the river to the south was the Crow.
Right.
And hundreds of acres of reservation land, and all of the dynamic of the Pegasus gold mine sitting on top of the Rocky Mountains, poisoning the reservation on one side. All of those.
What I'm hearing from Jim and what in that conversation, that definition of spiritual is again both grounded and communal.
Yes.
So often in Euro-American culture, we think of spiritual as this individual sitting in prayer, communing with something elsewhere, and spiritual as a grounded relation to a homeland with family and clan and tribe and nation. That's a different definition.
And certainly the way that the land was passed down had less to do with commercial transaction than it did to do with a certain amount of family heritage and that sort of thing too. We could identify there in that everybody's dream was to hand their land down to father to son sort of thing.
And that's an issue in your book.
Sure. What happens when you're not a son?
Maybe the issue.
Well, it was an issue in All But the Waltz, where she talked about her relative, surveying the land, turning landscape into property, which is a whole different. And my understanding of the Native Americans' relationship with land was it was a landscape through which provided them with the sustenance of life. And it
wasn't wilderness.
It wasn't wilderness. In fact, it's interesting that you should bring this up. I did a series of focus groups in Alaska about the concept of wilderness.
Really?
I did. And one of my focus groups were Native Alaskans.
Great.
Alaska Natives. And it was amazing to me that difference between, this sort of liberal context of what wilderness was and what Native Americans, Alaska Natives, wilderness was their back door. It wasn't wilderness. It wasn't foreign.
There.
It wasn't other. It was where they are and what they are, and and it really became apparent that when you take the people out of that, and that's really one of the things that happened, is
the national parks, they removed
yes,
the people.
They removed the people,
Right.
and then they put them in homes, and most of Alaska Natives were nomadic. I mean, they moved with the resources. They had to. And so suddenly you took away all of the identity and all of the roles within that community. And,
Well,
and you also damage the land because you're now
and that's where you
sitting on the same spot instead of, you know.
You're probably familiar with William Cronin's The Trouble with Wilderness, where he makes that point that wilderness is a projection from civilization.
Yes.
My favorite quote about that is Luther Standing Bear. In the early 20th century, he said there was no wilderness till the white man came.
Yeah.
Well, at least we did something.
Well, and let me just say, I think part of the agony in the jailing of Cecelia capture is the lack of what we're talking about here. I think Americans are aware. I mean, there's nostalgia and there's projections, but there's an awareness here of the spirit of that land, that spiritual connection. However, we may fail in that, and I think because this is written by a Native American, that very voice calls the reader to that, and it begins the path back to that at the end, literally through the need for tribal, legal representation on the land.
Yeah. And she also, I mean, the final scene takes place on the ground, and her fancy dress and her shoes get full of mud, and they get soaked.
Sore from,
And so she's coming back to urban land, and also connecting, to Bud. But that is not lost, the fact that she wasn't throwing herself upon the sofa to have a weep, that she was actually out there ruining her brand new French shoes.
But that was the juxtaposition, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the total urban outfit and the need to go back to the land.
There it is.
Yeah. Well, before we close, I would like to address the last issue, because it was one that we've talked about a lot, and that is sort of the difference between the way a man might approach his role in a tribal culture as opposed to a woman. You talked about the three big issues: gender, class, and race. How is gender really apparent? This is a woman writer writing a woman's story. How would this have played out differently had it been a man? And we talked about that it seemed like women turn towards self-destruction as opposed to lashing out at the very things that are putting them in this position.
Which not to change what you're saying, but men can be self-destructive in similar ways, probably different ones.
Sometimes I think more violent, just because that's allowed them,
externally violent.
Exactly,
Projecting.
But that's one of the ways that when I first read this, back when it first came out, I identified with that inward turning. You brutalize yourself first. Women tend to turn inward, and they live out their addictions, or they live out their self-destructive ways. They try to rely upon strong men to save them. They do all of these other things that I think perhaps is slightly different from the male manhood mandates that allowed, other behaviors. But
one of the plurals again about Indian country is that the different tribes have different gender relations, and how this may or may not play out in the novel is an important question. But just briefly for background, some tribes like the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee in upstate New York, are matriarchal, and the women install the chiefs and are smart enough to not be chiefs themselves. They can pull out the chiefs. The clan mothers are the deciders, as well as owning the property. whereas in High Plains it's a more patriarchal society, and differences in the Southwest.
Isn't Navajo also matriarchal, or is that Hopi?
I think so. I don't know that
Pueblo
culture as much as others.
The names are matriarchal. The names handed down are.
Hopi,
so,
you have
Hopi,
to have a mother
the clan,
who's Hopi. It's
your
very
clan
much like
name
Jewish.
is your mother's clan.
And so those are going to be background differences that may or may not play into a novel like this. But I really appreciate what you're saying about the self-destructive inward turning of the internalized oppression takes its different gender patterns as well.
One of the things that I noticed, again, most of my experience has been in Alaska, but I was there for 24 years, and they were critical for 24 years for Native groups in Alaska. And I noticed a real emergence of strong Native American women. And in fact, there's the Anchorage Daily News did a long series of People in Peril. They won a Pulitzer Prize for it.
Oh my, I'll look for that.
Yeah, very, very well done. And it really, women ultimately in various villages across Alaska started to organize and to take hold. And because there was rampant alcoholism and really and they really focused on their communities. And
well, current events, Idle No More is a major, it's now global indigenous movement about affirming land rights, basically, in the context of environmental damage. And Idle No More is driven by these amazing Canadian women. And as Faith Spotted Eagle, there's these 13 grandmothers group. They're literally, globally, there's Maori and Pacific Islander women's leadership. There's Sami in Scandinavian. There's this whole indigenous world movement that's largely in women's leadership, but not exclusively. But it's an important dimension.
I remember reading Sarah Winnemucca's speech before Congress. I must have been in high school.
Oh my!
And being stunned by.
She was so articulate.
And telling the truth about things. The agents and the starvation and the.
She called it the Indian Ring. These Bureau of Indian Affairs bureaucrats who would just scoop up the resources for their families.
Rob them.
Diane, do we have any other comments or questions by our chatters? Hello? Did we lose you, Diane? We may have lost her.
No, I had you on mute.
Oh, okay.
Once again, I was talking to myself.
Okay.
We won't take that personally.
We've covered we've covered all the questions that we got from chatters, and Judy, thank you so much for jumping in and getting the question on place. I really appreciate that, mainly because that's an important question to me also.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no further questions, then I think our hour is up, and I don't want to keep people any later than we must. But I can't tell you how I've appreciated the conversation, and I'm going to hold you to the list. You've mentioned a lot of really interesting reading, and I know some of us are going to want to...
I'll send you a lifetime reading plan.
Well, if you could highlight those of us, I mean, I've heard some, the Housemaid of Dawn, and there's some, it sounds to me like there are some critical ones that we would like to... Ceremony, and Fool's Crow, that would be really worth our reading is starting there at any rate. But thank you so much for your time, David. It was a great pleasure.
Also, before you go, David and Judy, I want you to know that the back chat here, everybody kept saying how wonderful this conversation was, how much they were interested in what you two were saying. So I am representing a lot of people in saying thank you very much for such an interesting talk.
Well, thank you for the chance to get to join in conversation.
It's a thrill to be able to talk about good books with smart people. So.
Well, thank you again, Judy, as always. You are really the kingpin around here, number one, having suggested these wonderful books. we look forward to our next book, which I've already started, which is, I have to refer to it again.
Yes,
Claiming Ground, and I have to tell you, I'm entranced already, and I'm going to that very part of the country later this summer.
Good for you.
I am, yeah. So I'm taking book in hand.
Little YO.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm going to go to the Pryor Mountains. So, and our next chat online will be March 25th. Online.
Okay.
That's where we chat online, not you. The next web session will be April 12th. Okay, but we'll get together with Diane on the chat to talk about Claiming Ground on Wednesday, March 25th at 6 p.m. as always. And Diane, thank you again for all that you do to keep us organized and to summarize the questions, and I really appreciate your participation. And I want to tell Judy that Diane is coming. She's bringing her granddaughter, and I think you should have your granddaughter too. We all have fun together.
I would love that. Yes.
Well, pictures of daughters and granddaughters all together in Dunroven.
Yeah.
I look forward to meeting you.
Yeah.
Oh, I look forward to meeting you, Judy.
Okay.
In person.
In person.
Thank you, Diane, and with that, we'll say goodnight from Dunroven Ranch. Thank you, Mackenzie, for manning the camera, and I assume that you will bring us all down. Good night, everyone.